Hello and welcome back to part 2 on this video on how to make this anime style explosion inside of Blender. We're making this mostly procedurally, well pretty much fully procedurally. So in the first part we made this fireball in GeoNodes and we did that with a couple of Voronoi displaces, and then we learned how to texture it, and now we're going to be focusing mainly in the shader editor to make these ring patterns on the floor and these lines that come out from the explosion. So I'm going to start up in a blank file again and just focus first of all on these rings, as that's the most complicated part of this. And like I say, this is going to be a purely shader based solution, so I'm just going to start with adding a plane into the scene. And now if I open up the shader editor over here on the right, I'm going to just turn off some of my overlays here and I'll put screencast keys on so you can see all the shortcuts. And now what I'm going to do is add a material to this, delete out the principled and add in an emission and a transparent. And I'll mix these together with Control Shift left mouse button drag and plug that into the surface. And now whatever I plug into this factor will act as a mask between sort of solid and transparent. So if we go into material preview, you can see I can sort of change that blend. I'm going to go ahead and in my material settings set this to blended from dithered so that it renders a lot quicker in Eevee, like so. Okay, so now we want to drive this factor based on our ring pattern. So in order to make a simple ring, I'm going to start out with the basis for all procedural shading, a texture coordinate node. And this basically gives us some vectors that we build either image textures from, or we can make procedural systems directly using these vectors. So I'm going to use the UVs on this texture coordinate node, and to center them, I'm going to use a vector math node set to subtract. And if I take away 0.5 on the X and the Y, you can see that it now centers around 0. We got this black corner here, which says to us it's going in the negative direction. So if I separate X, Y, Z, you can see we get these two gradients up and down. And before we centered it, they were going from sort of the edge of the plane, but now they start in the center, which is good because now I'm going to use a math node and I'm going to add the X and the Y together. And you can see this gives us a line, and this is actually the line of y equals x. So in order to make a circle, I'm going to use the equation for a circle and square both of these x and y components here. So I use a power node to set it to 2 on the x and 2 on the y. Now we've squared this and got a circle. Now to make this, instead of being like a faded line, I'm going to make it a hard edge. So I'm going to use a less than operation. And let's play with the value here to control how this goes, and make sure I subtract 0.5 so it's actually fully centered. And that's our first circle. Now I'm going to make another circle slightly smaller by duplicating this less than node and plugging in a slightly smaller value. And now I have two circles. If I take away this bottom one from the top one, we'll get a gap in the middle, and that will make us our ring. So let's subtract like so, and I'm going to clamp just to make sure the values are correct. And you can see we have a basic ring. And as I bring this value closer to the top value, this sort of can animate off. So I'm going to create a value node for that and plug that into here, set it to 0.05. And actually I'm going to multiply this down by 0.01 and set this to 5. So now I can go from 5 to 10, and this will just sort of dissipate out. So let's key that maybe around frame 30. Just insert a keyframe there, then maybe 10 frames later, we can have it be at 10. So we go like that. Very simple animation. Now the interesting part about this is distorting this to get the noise pattern. And I'm actually going to distort it before we do anything here. So I'm going to use a mix color node. And the reason I'm using mixed color is because we can change the mode to linear light here. And that you can see by default now it does nothing. But if I plug in a noise texture into the B input, you can see it really distorts it. And we can sort of control the strength of this with this factor. Now the problem is that this noise is just sort of uniform across the plane. It doesn't have any radial direction to it, which I want. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to construct my own sort of UV map for this noise texture. And I want the UV map to have a gradient that basically goes from here all the way around as our one dimension. And then you always need 2 dimensions for a coordinate system. So I'll have another gradient going sort of this line here. So from the center outwards. And that will be my map. And if you think about it, this UV map here is just 2 linear gradients. So I'm just going to make one of these circular and the other one sort of spherical. So I'm going to use a gradient texture node to help me with this. And let's use the UV map for this and set it to radial. Now we can't see anything. We're going to have to transform our UV map again by using this subtract trick to center it. And now you can see that's our first gradient done. This will be our seam here essentially, which we can try and hide in the 3D viewport. For our second gradient, let's use another gradient texture using the same vector here. And let's use spherical for this one. Actually, you know what? Let's not do that. Let's go ahead. We've already made our own circle over here. So let's just grab this little setup and use this again. And now we have our one going outwards and we have our gradient. So we can use both of these now. So now we need to combine these into our coordinate space. So let's combine X, Y, Z into the X and into the Y. Plug into the noise texture and you'll see we have like a much more radial thing going on here now. So now let's view the final output of this, and I'm just going to mess with these coordinates a little bit. So I'm going to use a math node maybe to add some offset to this this spherical one maybe. And I'm going to multiply it down as well. That's the wrong direction, but that's also kind of a cool effect. Let's multiply the other channel, and you can see now we get like a very ring type effect going on. Control the sort of frequency of it with the scale on the noise texture, play with the roughness and different types of things to control the amount of lines we're getting. But that's pretty good. Now if we want to make it spin, we could go ahead and add a value to this, and this will sort of spin the texture. So let's add a value before we multiply it down so that it's not so sensitive. And let's use a value node, and this is a trick I use all the time. I type in hashtag frame. That sets up an expression that matches the frame number of whatever frame we're on. And if I plug this into the add node here, you can see it spins really quick. And to turn this down, I'm just going to multiply the strength of this by like 0.1. And now it spins pretty quick, but not as quick. And layered up with our keyframed fade off, it looks pretty cool. So now let's go ahead and plug that into our mix shader at the very end and see what we've got. Oh, we need to invert our inputs. I'm going to use Alt S for that. And now you can see we have a nice solid ring and the outside like so. If we want to change the thickness, we just change the value of this 5 to be something a little lower, maybe 3, maybe a bit closer to 10, sorry, so something like 7. And now that it's a bit thinner as well. So that's pretty cool. Now let's set the strength to something like 3 to match what we were doing with the fireball and color it as well. To turn on some bloom, I'll go to the compositor, use nodes, add a glare node, same as what we did in part 1. Set it to bloom, and in the viewport shading, turn on the compositor always. So that's pretty cool for a ring. And now the only other thing that I did on this was just animate some, basic scaling on top of it. So you could go into keying, go to scale, and then on frame 0, maybe scale it to 0. And then by the time it's fading out, we want it to be sort of full sized, like that. And you could always go into the graph editor and sort of tweak the timing of this a little bit. So maybe you want it to sort of do more of a exponential curve like that. And maybe make it go a bit bigger. And you'll get a better sense for timing this when you bring it into the scene with the fireball as well. But I think that will work pretty good for now. And let's go ahead and start making the line. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this plane for now. Let's add in another plane, and I'm going to make this a bit thinner. Scale it in edit mode on the y-axis. And then let's give it a material. And let's call this line, delete out the principled again, add our emission and our transparent again, mix them together, and now we're ready to start. Set this to blended. So let's start again with the texture coordinate. And I'm going to start with UVs again and center them again, same way I did before by subtracting 0.5. And now let's separate this out to get our two gradients. I'm going to use this Y gradient, I'm going to mirror it and then make it a hard edge. So let's use a math node, set it to absolute, and this will just turn all the negative values positive. So it's a very quick and cheap way to mirror something. And then if I use a less than, and I set this to less than like 0.3 or something, maybe 0.2, you can see that we get this stripe. And that's pretty cool, but we want to make it so that it tapers at one end. So what I'm going to do is plug something into this threshold so that it varies along the length. What do we have that varies along the length? Well, we have this X gradient, so let's try plugging that in and see what happens. And you can see we get it starting at a point and then going to a full amount. So I don't think I want to center the X. So maybe it goes, it starts from the very bottom. And now I can maybe use a math node on this X value and multiply it to control the sort of thickness, the maximum thickness that we're seeing. So maybe 0.2 should be the max. And that would be a cool way to animate it too. Yeah, maybe you could do that if you wanted to, but I think I'm going to animate it a different way. What I'm going to do is essentially just add in another gradient and animate that gradient moving to sort of mask this off. Let's grab this X gradient again, set it to be less than, so we get a hard line. And this will be the parameter that I'm going to animate. And then I'm just going to multiply this on top of what we already have to sort of turn it off where it's 0. Like that. So now that's like a pretty neat way to animate this. And of course we need a gradient now going in the other direction to turn it off at the very beginning. So I'll add another multiply. And I will set this, duplicate this less than with the same gradient, but set it to greater than this time. And in this way, if I plug that into there, you can see that I have this gradient going in the other direction now, so I can sort of very easily control, like, if I want it to be on at certain points and off at certain points. So yeah, these two parameters I can now animate. And if you want to, you could set these up as attributes so that you don't have to have all the lines animated the same way. You could have the same material and with different animation on these values. And you could do this a couple of ways. One would be to add a custom property here, but I don't really like to do that. I prefer doing it in GeoNodes because you can reuse this node group. So I'm going to add a GeoNodes object, call it attributes underscore line. And then in geometry nodes, I'm going to store a named attribute, make it an input, and I'll just call this start, and I'll make another one for the end for those two attributes in the shader that we made. And I'll call them the same thing in here, start and end. And now back in the shader editor, we can add in an attribute node, grab start and end, plug in our factors here. And now if we plug in this into our mix shader here, we should be able to start to see this. Yep, I just need to invert it again. Good. And now we can animate these two parameters to animate the lines coming on and off. And what I like to do is move this whole plane in edit mode so that it starts at the origin and then sort of place these at the center of my explosion and duplicate them out a little bit, maybe scale them and rotate them around a bit to give it a bit of variation. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And now on each one of these, I can make the lines sort of start and end at different points. And You don't have to have this be a hard line, by the way. You could, use a color ramp instead of this less than and sort of have it fade off more, but I think a hard line is fine for this sort of very graphical effect. And it's going to be so quick as well that it doesn't really matter too much. So yeah, going back to my original file, you can see this is the same technique I used. I also scaled the lines a little bit as well, so that there's multiple layers of animation going on. So it has a bit more interest to it. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this. Hopefully you can now take all these various elements and combine them to make your own explosion. And you could also use these same techniques to make various styles of effects. And just by tweaking some of the procedural systems we have, you can make your own very custom looking 2D style effects. So thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next one.